Well, another very warm welcome back, all my vintage dirt bike loving YouTubers, and thanks to you all once again for returning to my classic dirt bike TV channel. Now, with regards to our subscriber total, it looks like we're heading in the right direction. We've had quite a few brand new subscribers signed up since my last video posting. We're certainly heading in the right direction to our brand new 12,000 subscriber total. So thanks to each and every one of you for your support in that department. Okay, with regards to the lockdown here in Scotland, our intrepid leader has now announced to the world that we can now change from stay at home to stay local, which means that I can travel around in my local county, but unfortunately can't cross any borders as yet, but it's still a step in the right direction. Okay, coming up in this next video, we're going to take another walk through the paddock and bring you some more of those classic dirt bikes that I know you love to see. So without any further delay, let's just jump straight into our first machine. Okay, we're going to kick things off here with a look at a couple of very nice Honda CR250 Elsinores, and this first machine is Chris Lewis's example. And these particular clips were taken at the Cumberland Grand National back in 2019. Now, these CR250M Elsinores have always been regarded as Honda's first ever purpose-built motocrosser, because up until they launched this bike, I think it was back in 1973, many of Honda's other motocrossers of the time were really just adapted road bikes. Now, Chris's bike here is not a fully original example, of course, due to it having a replacement alloy swing arm, as of course the LC original would have been made of tubular steel way back in the day. But in terms of these 250 two-stroke power plants, these were great little motors that put out around, I think it was about 30 horsepower, and I think they had a 5-speed gearbox, and reputedly weighed only around 230 pounds, which made it a very light and flickable little racer. Now, Honda had used magnesium in the motor's crank casings to again keep the full up weight of the bike to the minimum, but even without magnesium casings this would still have been a quite light little motorcycle. Now, as far as I remember, these had an alloy fuel tank and alloy side panels, and really Honda couldn't have launched this model at a better time in the early 1970s, because motocross was exploding across the globe at this point, and the world was crying out for a proper purpose-built motocross machine, and Honda filled this demand perfectly with this little rocket ship, as they sold in their hundreds of thousands. But these superb little screamers certainly put Honda on the motocross map back in the 1970s, and when the likes of Hollywood film star Steve McQueen was seen endorsing them on TV, sales of these Elsinores were increased dramatically, which is a bit ironic really when you think of it, that when Mr. Honda took over the company away back in the day, he announced that he would never ever build a two-stroke motorcycle, but of course the other big three of Yamaha, Suzuki and Kawasaki were already making two-stroke motocrossers and were achieving decent sales targets, so Honda just had to bite the bullet and get on board or be left behind. But this other 250 Elsinore here is Andy Story's little race bike, and once more this is another good example of one of these Elsinores, although again maybe not a fully original bike because of its alloy swing arm, different rear shocks and upgraded exhaust. But to be fair, it's not easy finding a fully original Elsinore from 1973 or 74, and if there are any out there, then more than likely they are never to be used or seen on a motocross racetrack. But as you're no doubt aware, these Elsinores got their name from the Lake Elsinore dirt bike race in the USA, which was an absolutely massive event in the late 1960s and 70s. And Honda's marketing ploy was to associate their new motocross bike with a big race event, and the idea was an absolute belter because it certainly helped Honda sell many more bikes. And also, some of these Elsinores were used on Bruce Brown's documentary movie On Any Sunday. And as I mentioned, Steve McQueen actually took part in that film, riding, of course, an Elsinore. So really, how big an endorsement do you need than to help sell your motorcycles? But overall, these Honda motocrossers certainly took dirt bike riding to the very next level, and I'm sure you don't need me to tell you about the many other very successful two-stroke motocross machines that Honda has produced since then, because they were, and they still are, regarded as the market leaders of off-road racing dirt bikes. Okay, next up, this is just a few short clips of a very nice 500 Husqvarna that I came across on my Paddock travels just a few years back. Now naturally, it's a Husky 500 Twinshocker that's had modern front suspension fitted to it on the front end and a different rear swing arm, but it's still quite a nice looking race bike, and I'm not even sure if the frame is a Husqvarna chassis, as those rear shocks are certainly placed at a jointy angle and are quite long. Although it seems to be the thing in this modern day to fit more modern parts to these vintage racers, although usually if you keep to the twin shock racing rules, which say that the bike must have an air-cooled motor, drum brakes on the front and rear, and of course twin shock rear suspension, then generally it qualifies to race as a twin shocker. But you can certainly take it from me that these big two-stroke 500 Husky motors are certainly the dog's bollocks, because I actually owned and raced one of these bikes back in the day, and they were never short of horsepower, that's for sure. Although with myself just being a pretty mediocre club racer, I more than likely only used half of what this motor actually had in its tank. But as you can see, a very substantial set of modern forks on this machine, but don't ask me what bike they're being taken from, because I don't have a clue, but they certainly look heavy duty, that's for sure, and they will be slightly better than the Husky originals. But this is still quite a nice looking bike all the same, and I'd love to have taken a few more shots of the bike from the other side, although I didn't dare touch this bike if the owner was not around, just in case he thought that I was trying to steal it. Okay, next up is another lovely machine from the Matty Taylor workshop, and this lovely M.T.S Special Tribsa was captured at the Classic Motocross the Nations event at Reading in the UK back in 2015. Now, I don't know much about this particular bike other than it's a BSA frame with, of course, the Triumph twin motor in the chassis. Now, you may remember some time back that I did post a video featuring another one of these M.T.S bikes with a big single cylinder 500 Jawa motor in its chassis, so if you've not had a look at that, then maybe try and check it out if you can. But it certainly looks like a big BSA drum brake here on the front, and what looks like a pair of Italian Seriani forks, which were a very popular fitment on these older BSA chassis way back in the day. Now, I can only imagine what this Triumph motor sounds like when it gets fired up and is actually running, and the sound that it makes from this quite unique 2-into-1 exhaust system, because there's certainly something about a British-made Triumph twin 4-stroke motor when they're used as vintage scramblers, because they have a very unique sound that you just don't get from a big single-cylinder 4-stroker. Although I must say I'd like to have gained a bit more information on this bike, although these short clips were taken very early in the morning, and I was certainly getting some very strange looks from the early birds who were watching me through their tents and caravans as they were watching me sneaking around and filming all of these lovely bikes. But I can assure you that my intentions were purely honourable. And it also looks like this bike's been fitted with one of those QD rear wheels, or quick detach, I think they called them back in the day. But nevertheless, this is again another very nice looking race bike, and another of the rare and fascinating motorcycles that you can catch a glimpse of if you just take a walk through a vintage racing motocross paddock. Okay, next up we're going to take a brief look at this Honda CR250 White Rocket, and this was a bike that I came across at Drumlandrig Castle back in 2017. Now, it's quite a nice looking bike in white, of course, which is a far cry from the standard and original red Rocket with, of course, that fiery red engine. Although I have seen a few examples of these kind of Hondas in various other colours in the past, and specifically I did see one that was in black with a black tank and black plastics, and even a black motor, which I thought was a nice looking machine. But once again, another different interpretation of one of these CR250s, although I'm not sure as to why anybody would want to fit a chrome expansion chamber to a dirt bike, although I expect it's just to keep up with the brighter theme of the bike in this white livery. But nevertheless, it's still a tidy looking bike all the same, still fitted with these Fox air shocks on the rear, although the bike still appears to have many of its other original parts still fitted on it. But these were, and of course still are, very good choices if you want to try your hand at vintage motocross racing, because there are plenty rockets available and parts are easily enough to come by. So if you're in the market for a new bike, then these CR250s are certainly worth considering, because they are a very good racing package, and of course very quick to boot. Okay, next up we're going to take a look at Mike van der Meer's lovely 1981 250 Maico, or Maico if you pronounce it in that particular way, although mostly here in Europe and especially here in the UK we still tend to call these bikes Maicos. Now, of course, this is the baby brother to the hugely successful 1981 490 Mega 2 Maico, that's still regarded as one of the best motocross bikes ever made, although these smaller 250s were still a great clubman's racing bike, and although they may have lacked the outright grunt of its bigger brother, you could still achieve very good results on one of these 250s, especially if the track was tight and twisty, where of course the bigger bikes couldn't make use of their more superior power. But I have to say that these 250 reed valve motors were still very good little engines, because I actually raced a similar bike to this back in the day, although my particular Maico motor was fitted into a 1980 chassis. Now, as you'd expect, drum brakes for 1981, and it looks like Mike's also had a replacement alloy brake backplate fitted onto his machine. But again, a standard steel swing arm and rear brake hub, which to be fair did have decent stopping power for its time, of course as long as you kept it dry. Now, the expansion chamber and tailpipe are again replacement upgrades, which is another good reason to consider one of these older Maicos as a vintage race bike, because there are a good supply of original and upgraded parts for these bikes now, so you can do quite a lot with them if you want to customize or personalize your own bike. But as you know, these 250s had a similar frame geometry to the bigger 490, so they were a very good handling bike in that respect. And if you experimented with different weights of oils in the front forks and bolted on a good set of rear shocks, then you did have a pretty competitive race bike. And if you were prepared to wring its neck using that throttle gasser and dance up and down on the gearbox, you could certainly put yourself up there on the podium at the end of the day. Okay, just to finish off this latest volume 8 of our Bikes from the Paddock videos, we're going to take a look at Billy Pentland's YZ490 at Yamaha. Now, I'm not entirely sure as to the year of Billy's bike, although I think it could possibly be an 84 machine. Now, as I remember, these big 490s came out around 1982 and were supposed to be a replacement for the hugely successful YZ465, although unfortunately these bigger 490 motocrossers were a bit disappointing when owners got their hands on them for the very first time. Because first up, the overall weight of this bike was much heavier than the previous 465, and it wasn't as reliable either, and riders say they were an absolute bitch of a bike to start, and they vibrated badly when they were actually running. Now, the suspension wasn't the best either, although Yamaha did try and fix these problems, but none of them really worked in the long term. But with regards the YZ490's motor, it did have grunt in absolute bucket loads, although much of it was really at the top end, which wasn't great because when you hit that sweet spot, these motors did have a tendency to cough and splutter and would then start pinging or pinking, and riders then had to back off the power to stop the motor from blowing itself to pieces. But don't get me wrong here, these were still very good, powerful motocrosser power plants. They just needed lots of sorting out, and if you were prepared to take the time to fix all of its idiosyncrasies and make certain improvements to the suspension system, then these could still be turned into a very decent open class race bike. Now, these particular YZ490s had these Z spoke systems on the wheels, which was basically two spokes that when they were joined together on the hub, they formed one long spoke that ran from one side of the wheel rim to the other. And there were also problems with these alloy casting mounts breaking off, which of course is something that you don't want if you're flying along a bumpy track with the throttle pinned back. Now, Billy's bike's not a fully original example, but it's still nice to see one of these older Yamahas still getting used on a motocross racetrack, because many riders tended to shy away from these older YZs purely because of the bad press that they received when they were launched. But as I said, if you knew your way around these bikes and were kind of handy with the spanners, or even knew somebody that could sort them out for you, then these were still as quick as any bike on the racetrack. Now, once again, Yamaha's Z spoke system on the rear wheel, which some people say wasn't one of their greatest ideas. But you may remember that I posted a video some time back when the owner of this particular bike converted one of these YZ490 monoshockers to a twin shock race bike. So if you've not had a look at that, then try and check it out on my YouTube channel. But once again, this is a very decent example of what I think is an 84 YZ Yamaha, and Billy is certainly a fan of his big Yamahas, and I hope you enjoyed taking a look at his bike, and of course the others that we've featured in this volume 8 edition of Bikes from the Paddock. Well, I do hope you enjoyed that latest collection of classic dirt bikes from around the racing paddocks, and hopefully it won't be too long before we're back out there at race events in 2021, bringing you brand new machines for you to take a look at. Okay, coming up in my next video, we're going to take a look at a few classic CCM machines. So if you like your Alan Clues 4-stroke race bikes, then I hope you tune in for my next video when we'll be taking a look at some of the bikes in Stuart Rodin's dirt bike collection. So I hope you'll join me for that. So until then, everybody continue to keep safe and well, and I hope you'll all return to talk about vintage racers when we all return here to Classic Dirt Bike TV.